Okay, beginning on page 58. I guess I gotta start on I gotta read the whole paragraph. But I think the discussion in the previous chapter will enable anyone to see wherein lies the fallacy of this reasoning, a fallacy which has entangled some of the most acute minds in a web of their own spinning. It is in the use of the term capital in two senses. In the primary proposition that capital is necessary to the exertion of productive labor, the term capital is understood as including all food, clothing, shelter, etc., whereas in the deductions finally drawn from it, the term is used in its common and legitimate meaning of wealth devoted, not to the immediate gratification of desire, but to the procurement of more wealth, of wealth in the hands of employers as distinguished from laborers. The conclusion is no more valid than it would be from the acceptance of the proposition that a laborer cannot go to work without his breakfast and some clothes, to infer that no more laborers can go to work than employers first furnish with breakfast and clothes. Now, the fact that laborers generally furnish their own breakfast and clothes in which they go to work, and the further fact is that capital, in the sense in which the word is used in distinction to labor, in exceptional cases sometimes may, but is never compelled to make advances to labor before the work begins. Of all the vast number of unemployed laborers in the civilized world today, there is probably not a single one willing to work who could not be employed without any advance of wages. A great proportion would doubtless gladly go to work on terms which did not require the payment of wages before the end of a month. It is doubtful if there are enough to be called a class who would not go to work and wait for their wages until the end of the week, as most laborers habitually do, while there are certainly none who would not wait for their wages until the end of the day, or, if you please, until the next meal hour. The precise time of the payment of wages is immaterial. The essential point, the point I lay stress on, is that it is after the performance of work. The payment of wages, therefore, always implies the previous rendering of labor. Now, what does the rendering of labor in production imply? Evidently, the production of wealth, which, if it is to be exchanged or used in production, is capital. Therefore, the payment of capital in wages presupposes a production of capital by labor for which the wages are paid. And as an employer generally makes a profit, the payment of wages is, so far as he is concerned, but the return to the laborer of a portion of the capital he has received from the labor. So far as the employee is concerned, it is but the receipt of a portion of the capital his labor has previously produced. As the value paid in the wages is thus exchanged for a value brought into being by the labor, how can it be said that wages are drawn from capital or advanced by capital? As in the exchange of labor for wages, the employer always gets the capital created by the labor before he pays out capital in the wages. At what point is his capital lessened, even temporarily? Bring the question to the test of facts. Take, for instance, an employing manufacturer who is engaged in turning raw materials into finished products, cotton into cloth, iron into hardware, leather into boots, or so on, as may be, and who pays his hands, as is generally the case, once a week. Make an exact inventory of his capital on Monday morning before the beginning of work, and it will consist of his building, machinery, raw material, money on hand, and finished products in stock. Suppose, for the sake of simplicity, that he neither buys nor sells during the week, and after work has stopped and he has paid his hands on Saturday night, take a new inventory of his capital. The item of money will be less, for it has been paid out in wages. There will be less raw material, less coal, etc., and a proper deduction may be made from the value of the buildings and machinery for the week's wear and tear. But if he is doing a remunerative business, which must on the average be the case, the item of finished products will be so much greater as to compensate for all these deficiencies and show in the summing up an increase of capital. Manifestly, then, the value he paid his hands and wages is not drawn from his capital or from anyone else's capital. It came not from capital, but from the value created by the labor itself. There was no more advance of capital than if he had hired his hands to dig clams and paid them with a part of the clams they dug. Their wages were as truly the produce of their labor as were the wages of the primitive man when long before the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock he obtained an oyster by knocking it with a stone from the rocks. As the laborer who works for an employer does not get his wages until he has performed the work, his case is similar to that of the depositor in a bank who cannot draw money out until he has put money in. And as by drawing out what he has previously put in, the bank depositor does not lessen the capital of the bank, neither can laborers by receiving wages lessen even temporarily either the capital of the employer or the aggregate capital of the economy. Their wages no more come from capital than the checks of depositors are drawn against bank capital. It is true that laborers in receiving wages do not generally receive back wealth in the same form in which they have rendered it, any more than bank depositors receive back in identical coins or banknotes they have deposited, but they receive it in an equivalent form, and as we are justified in saying that the depositor receives from the bank the money he paid in, so we are justified in saying that the laborer receives in wages the wealth he has rendered in labor. That this universal truth is so often obscured is largely due to that fruitful source of economic obscurities, the confounding of wealth with money, and it is remarkable to see so many of those who, since Dr. Adam Smith made the egg stand on its head, have copiously demonstrated the fallacies of the mercantile system, fall into delusions of the very same kind in treating of the relations of capital and labor, money being the general medium of exchanges, the common flux through which all transmutations of wealth from one form to another take place. Whatever difficulties may exist to an exchange will generally show themselves on the side of reduction to money, and thus it is sometimes easier to exchange money for any other form of wealth than it is to exchange wealth in a particular form into money, for the reason that there are more holders of wealth who desire to make some exchange than there are who desire to make any particular exchange. And so a producing employer who has paid out his money in wages may sometimes find it difficult to turn quickly back into money the increased value for which his money has really been exchanged, and is spoken of as having exhausted or advanced his capital in the payment of wages. Yet, unless the new value created by the labor is less than the wages paid, which can only be an exceptional case, the capital which he had before in money, he now has in goods. It has been changed in form, but not lessened. There is one branch of production in regard to which the confusions of thought which arise from the habit of estimating capital in money are least likely to occur, inasmuch as its product is the general material and standard of money. And it so happens that this business furnishes us, almost side by side, with illustrations of production passing from the simplest to the most complex forms. In the early days of California, as afterward in Australia, the placer miner who found in riverbed or surface deposit the glittering particles which the slow processes of nature had for ages been accumulated, picked up or washed out his wages. So too he called them, in actual money, for coin being scarce, gold dust passed as currency by weight, and at the end of the day he had his wages and money in a buckskin bag in his pocket. There can be no dispute as to whether these wages came from capital or not. They were manifestly the produce of his labor, nor could there be any dispute when the holder of a specially rich claim hired men to work for him and paid them off in the identical money which their labor had taken from gulch or bar. As coin became more abundant, its greater convenience in saving the trouble and loss of waiting assigned gold dust to the place of a commodity, and with coin obtained by the sale of the dust their labor had produced, the employing miner paid off his hands. Where he had coin enough to do so, instead of selling his gold dust at the nearest store and paying a dealer's profit, he retained it until he got enough to take a trip or send by express to San Francisco, where at the mint he could have it turned into coin without charge. While thus accumulating gold dust, he was lessening his stock of coins, just as the manufacturer, while accumulating his stock of goods, lessens his stock of money. Yet no one would be obtuse enough to imagine that in thus taking in gold dust and paying out coin, the miner was lessening his capital. Oh shit. Second paragraph 62.